thank you. I hope you can all hear me properly, and I've already been introduced, so I think I'll start by just sharing my PowerPoint and start talking right away. So just a minute. So now I hope you can see my first slide, medieval masculinities and bodies. And there you also got my email address if anyone wants to contact me afterwards, if you have any questions or anything else. And my PhD study has been an archaeological study of human skeletal remains. So there will be quite a lot of pictures of human bone in this presentation. And I mean, you can already see some in this picture of a burial. So if anyone feels uncomfortable with that, I just want to warn you what is coming up ahead. Now let's have a look then. Masculinities, what is that? Well, the masculinities, this word can be used and mean several different things. So I just want to share with you how I have used the concept. And I've started with a definition from Connell's famous book on masculinities called Masculinities. And their masculinities is defined as a configuration of practices. So in this definition, masculinity is not sort of a trait of an individual, some kind of essential quality that you either possess or you don't possess, but rather a type of activity. So you do something masculine, it's something you enact, basically. And this means that you're not automatically masculine just because you happen to be male. And the other way around, people who have other sexes could also be masculine or do masculinity. So this concept is a very useful definition to study masculinity through bone, and I will explain how this comes in a minute. Now, what masculinity actually contains, what kind of activities are regarded as masculine is very changeable, so I can't really say something general about it. It is context specific, and it changes over time, and it can even change through the life course of a single individual. So it has to be examined for the specific case. And that's of course why it's interesting to study masculinities in the past, because they could be different, or you might find similarities with contemporary society. There's also great diversity of masculinities. I mean, in some societies, this concept might be completely irrelevant. And in many other societies, there are several different ways to be doing masculinity. And there could also be a hierarchy, so certain ways are seen as better than others. In Connell's concept, this most sort of highly regarded version of masculinity is called the hegemonic masculinity. So you can see sort of a dominance through hegemony rather than by force. Then other versions are subordinate in different ways. And whether this is applicable to medieval conditions or not is perhaps something that it could be debated, but still, even if not all societies in the past could be studied using these theoretical frameworks, many scholars in different disciplines such as history and literature and archaeology have used the theories of masculinity to study gender relations in medieval Europe. So it seems to fit, at least for this particular context. And I also found it really useful to see new aspects of life in the past. And yeah, let's have a look at some masculinities then from medieval time. And I just collected a lot of different pictures of men in medieval time, just to show you kind of the diversity. The sort of dominant or hegemonic masculinities that scholars have put forward for the medieval Europe has been the masculinity of the lay elite, sort of warriors, the knights, And that is part of the concept that it is people who are in a dominant position in society who have the privilege of defining what is masculine and how a man should behave. So it's not strange to think of the lay elite as those who have the power to define hegemonic masculinity in medieval Europe. And that could be, for example, knights or perhaps crusaders, or in the context of Northern Europe, maybe Vikings, even if we're in the earlier medieval period. And then this masculinity is associated with qualities such as strength and endurance and bravery and warrior skills, authority, independence, but also things like self-control and piety. And this would then be sort of attractive to behave in ways that show that you possess these qualities, would be attractive not just for the elite, but for other men as well. One opposition that is often stressed when you are studying medieval masculinities is the opposition between the clerical masculinity and the masculinity of the laity, because clerics, they were not allowed many of the most characteristic activities of laymen, how they enacted masculinity. So things such as sex and violence and economic independence was something that you gave up if you, for example, entered a monastic order. Then you had to live a life of chastity and poverty. So this has led to the question if, okay, are men of the church, are they less masculine than other men in this context? Or are they perhaps not even masculine at all? Is this some form of third gender that applies to men who are clerics? And I will talk more about this later on, but like a little spoiler, I do not totally agree with this image, and I think it might be more complicated to sort of define which masculinity is dominant and which is subordinate, and just allow for a greater variety and not see like just because this type of masculinity is different does not make it a new gender automatically. So let's have a look then at the archaeology. In the field of bioarchaeology of identities, sort of studying biological things like bone to do archaeology. The bioarchaeology of identities is sort of a field of study where you examine identities in the past using human remains, and this could be identities such as ethnicity or socioeconomic status or gender. And this field of study is like well established, but it's fairly new. It's been like the last few decades that scholars have been taking an interest in this. While the study of sex based on osteological analysis, sort of the biological sex of an individual, that goes much further back to look for the differences between male and female body in the bone. And this image shows an example of the difference. I try to find images that are as sort of characteristic as possible of a feminine hip bone, os coxae, and a masculine one. So here feminine and masculine just refers to the shape of the bone and if it looks feminine or masculine. And as you can see, they have sort of different proportions. Even if you have very similar bones, the proportions of them are different, so you can tell them apart. And this is of course related to the different roles of men and women in reproduction, and that the female os coxae then is broader to allow her to give birth. And then you can look at other parts of the skeleton as well, but this would be like the most characteristic and easiest part to look at if you have a well-preserved human skeleton. So studies of gender in the past is fairly new, using osteological methods, like at least compared to sex. And this could go back to sort of the question like, what is sex and what is gender, and what does it mean when you look at the bones? And the division between these concepts have been questioned from a queer perspective, that sex is perhaps not only something natural, some feature of the body, but it involves a cultural interpretation of the body. And the other way around, that gender, even if this is considered to be a cultural construction, it's not totally independent of the body. These construction of what it means to be a man or to be a woman have an impact on our bodies, on what we do to our bodies, and they can have an effect on the skeleton. So skeleton will look different depending on how you are doing gender. Activities associated with different genders in osteology. And this first image of the lady carrying a basket is from a book called The Body as Material Culture, which was an inspiration for me in the first place to start this research. It's by Sofer, and she shows how the body is affected by then division of labor between men and women. And in this example, a typical feminine task then in this cultural context is to carry heavy loads on your back, and this can lead to bone change in your vertebra. So the vertebra in this image is not from this lady or from this, even from this context. It's a picture I took of some of the bones I've been studying, just to show you how there's bone growth here because of the heavy load on the back. So the body is altered by what you do. And then if you compare male and female skeletons, then you can see that they've been doing different things, basically. And if you study masculinities, then it's not like comparing male and female skeletons, but rather to compare different groups of males to see if they have been doing different activities or perhaps enacted masculinity in different ways. Okay, so this is showing the two materials I've used in my research. There are two monastic sites, one in Iceland and one in Sweden, both medieval monastic communities, where the burials have been excavated for the entire cemeteries. So they're quite large collections of human remains. And then I selected those individuals with good preservation, where you can make sex and age estimations, in total 129 from Skriðuklaustur and 342 from Västerås met those criteria. So there then a few hundred individuals that I have examined to look for, similarities and differences, and see what might come up. And I used that standard osteological methods, but also some lab analysis that I have not performed myself, but I've been performed on these materials for stable isotope analysis and radiocarbon dating. Okay, so here are some people eating and drinking. And this is just to illustrate that one way to express identity could be the kind of food you eat and what you drink. And to study this, you could use stable isotope analysis. And here's a picture of a sampling site on a mandible. The tiny little hole, that is the small amount of bone that is needed to do this type of analysis. Because the stable isotopes of carbon and nitrogen differs depending on what kind of food you're eating, and that will affect the isotope composition in your body. So this is a way to study the sort of overall diet, not single meals, but what a person has been eating over a period of years when the bone is forming. And in medieval time, the medical discourse then was that a major difference between men and women was that men were considered to be much hotter and women to be colder. And this heat would then cause the other differences. So for example, the facial and body hair that men were able to grow was because they were hotter. And also they would be like stronger, more energetic, more active than women, because women were too cold. They didn't have the energy, basically. And this was not just something that you could stand by and watch. It was something you could have, do things to change yourself. So if you eat a lot of meat, you will increase your heat and, increase your virility as well in this way, as you associate heat with being a man. And this could be a good thing. For example, if you are weak and unhealthy and need the meat to restore your health. or like a warrior going to battle and needs some extra energy and virility. But it could also be problematic if you get too much heat, especially if you're a part of the clergy, because then you sort of have to restrain yourself, and this heat could also lead to an increased sexual desire. So you might commit sins if you got too hot. So basically meat eating was associated then with masculinity, virility, but at the same time something that the church were a bit suspicious of, and there were rules on diet then that they imposed, that you should avoid meat eating on quite a lot of days. And during these fasting days, then you had a restricted diet with the meat of quadrupeds, more or less mammals, but not exactly mammals, but animals like that. It was not allowed, but you could still eat like vegetables and bread, and sometimes it was also allowed to eat fish and dairy products. So fish eating would then be sort of the religious diet, the clerical diet, and meat eating more of a diet of the laity. So I was looking like, could you see this difference in the isotope results? And this chart sort of plots the results. So you can see carbon, which is a way that is the C down here in this image. So right to left in the image. Would show if your diet is based mainly on marine sources like fish, or more from terrestrial sources, food from dry land such as vegetables, meat, and also actually fish if it was from a lake instead of from the ocean. And the N here is nitrogen, so those at the lower end here had lower nitrogen values than the one at the top. And nitrogen differs depending on your position in the food chain. So people eating a lot of vegetables would be down at the bottom. If you eat meat from herbivores, you end up a little bit higher. Meat from carnivores up at the top. And as all these people display fairly land-based diets, they're not much marine contributions to the diet. A likely source of food then is freshwater fish, as they have long food chains in the waters compared to, you don't eat that much carnivores from land animals, but like eating pike, for instance, from a lake, that could end you up at the top here. So the idea was that you could perhaps find a difference here, that males and females might have different diet, or males of different socioeconomic status, or perhaps adults and children, if you compare them. And you can see in the key here that there are different groups. For example, the red ones indicate they're males who are buried inside a church, a high status area, compared to the green ones, which are buried in the cemetery, so lower status at least. But there were no such differences. As you can see, they're sort of scattered all over the place. So I couldn't find no significant difference. The mean value here indicated by the cross at 13, more or less, that is rather high, and would suggest that all of the people, sort of at least in average, would consume quite a lot of fish. So likely they all more or less at least follow the regulations by the church. And I think this could be an example of how clerical ideas did not only apply to the clerics themselves, that just as ideas from the hegemonic or the warrior masculinity could give an impression on everyone's behavior, the ideals of clerical masculinity could also have an impact on laity, so that everybody wanted to eat like a pious monk, at least to some extent. So you see sort of influences in both directions here. And I mean, this is a small sample, but similar results have been found at other sites, other monastic sites, when people have been looking for the typical diets of monks. It's very hard to find any significant difference to other groups. And generally, in these studies of medieval burials, when you study isotopes, the diets seem to be very influenced by religious rules. So there's a lot of fish eating, both from freshwater fishes and marine fish, becomes really popular in the medieval period. So it's not just this small sample, this is like a general trend in the period. But there are also differences, and one such is in the use of interpersonal physical violence. And now I hope you can all see a close-up on a cranium, because I'm now going to talk a little bit about a difference between clerics and laity. And that is that when you look at physical violence, this could have an impact on the bone. And in this cranium, you see a healed trauma sort of here in the middle. This depression here is a healed fracture. There were rules on behavior, like you're allowed to use violence in certain circumstances and doing it in a certain manner. And that could even be used as a way to enact masculinity. But that provided that you're a lay person. If you're a cleric, it's very much restricted. You're not allowed to carry weapons or shed blood or participate in warfare. And therefore, you could suspect that clerics have fewer injuries like this than laymen. And then if I look at the results of the analysis, now let's have a look. If I move to the next picture, can you see a little diagram here with Västerås and Skriðuklaustur, males and females? Oh, great. And these are the percentages of individuals where I could detect this type of injury. So you can see in Skriðuklaustur, they're quite unusual, both in male and female, that's M and F. Like slightly over 5% of the examined individuals. While in Västerås, the females are still not very common to have injuries, but males, you have 20% of the individuals almost had some type of healed or unhealed weapon-related trauma. So this shows that there was definitely some sort of difference here between different groups of males. Well, the first impression here might be like, okay, so they were more violent in Sweden than in Iceland in those days. But I don't think that is the explanation. I think there are other differences that are more important here, referring to the background of these men who were buried at these two sites. For example, if you look at Skriðuklaustur, you can see that none of the Augustinian canons buried there and none of the lay brothers had any of these injuries. The people who actually had it, the males who actually had it, were patients at the hospital in Skriðuklaustur. So the rules that clerics should avoid violence seem to be followed. In Västerås, I've not been able to detect which of the individuals who were the clerics, but you can see at least a difference between different burial areas. And as you can see in the north, those who were buried in the northern part of the church, they're almost, or even I think it's slightly more even than 30%, nearly a third of them had these type of injuries, while those who were buried in the eastern part, which is sort of closest to the high altar and a very prestigious place to be buried, we perhaps have prominent members of the order or so, there are much fewer, even if there's still more than the females. I think the ones actually who got these injuries who were buried in the east were those who were buried in brick tombs. So these would be kind of luxury burials for members of the elite. Nice location close to the altar and sort of elaborate structure on your grave. But these men buried in the north of the church, that's still like a fairly nice burial place to be buried in a church of priory. Many of them had battle-related injuries, so sharp force trauma. You see swords, cuts, so they seem to have battle experience. But many of the wounds were also smaller blunt force trauma that could likely have been from other type of violent encounters. But it seems to be like the same group of men, parts of the lay elite, some of them maybe warriors, who sort of engaged in violence in many different situations. And for them, that was probably an acceptable way to behave and considered masculine as long as you did it by the rules. But then, of course, there were always some people who break the rules, and that can be hard to study using osteology, as there's always this possibility with different interpretations, and you have to speculate a bit. Okay, what was the case for this individual in this situation, and maybe there are different explanations that made it acceptable to break the rules, and they were not considered as transgressions. But I'll look at some examples that at least might be, people who do not behave accordingly, as they were supposed to do. And one of them was that to do violence sort of properly, you should have an equal opponent able to defend himself. And then the attack on women would not be it would not be a great display of masculinity. It could rather be seen as unmanly behavior. And most of the victims that you could see before were male, but there were also a few female victims. And one of them is the one you can see here, number 81. And there are cut marks here, unhealed blade wounds to the cranium. So this would then be an attack probably on a defenseless victim. Not only was she female, but she also had severe pathological changes throughout the skeleton. So rather unhealthy woman as well. Another thing that you were not supposed to do was to sneak up on someone and attack them from behind. That would not be very honorable. And most injuries that I could see in the material were on the face or forehead or sort of front of your body. But there are also exceptions, such as this cranium you can see here. This is sort of the back of the head, and you have a massive cut here that this person actually survived. So it's healed. That's why it sort of looks like it's covered in cream and it's all soft and rounded. So it's someone who survived an attack from behind. Of course, it could also matter who you are. So if you are a cleric, then violence would be much more restricted, and even a small use of violence could be a transgression. Now, I haven't found any evidence on that in my research, but there are both archaeological evidence and historical sources that mention that this happened, that clerics used violence and even killed people or participated in warfare. So I suppose if you had a larger material to study, you would find these exceptions, even if most of the clerics were peaceful. Women practicing violence could also be seen as an exception, as they would then do something that was generally seen as a masculine behavior. And there were situations when this was seen as justified and even expected, such as chastising your servants, for example, but then you're not supposed to break their bones. It's just more lesser violence. And one individual in this research material, one female who had a blunt force trauma to the cranium, also had a metacarpal fracture. That is a fracture of the bone here in the hand, which you typically sustain by hitting something hard with a fist. So, I mean, she could have been an innocent victim, but she could also be a woman who was actually participating in fist fights and not acting perhaps very feminine. But as I said, in individual examples, it's hard to know. She could have hurt her hand in some other way. Then a short comment on changes of masculinity also throughout your life course. And one change that you could do is a change of diet. In this chart, the individuals are sampled both as children and as adults. The round, the round dots, they are samples from teeth, and teeth form in childhood. While the squares are samples from bone, which remodules throughout life. So here you can compare the diet in a single individual, what they ate as a child and as an adult. And for most, there was not a major change, but there are some examples where the diet has changed. And one of them is this red fellow up here called A12. And this male was buried at the eastern part of the church in the choir, close to the high altar. So someone of probably high social standing. And as you can see, as an adult, he had the most enriched nitrogen values. So this could be explained by him being rather strict about his diet and avoiding meat in favor of fish. And sulfur values, which is not seen in this chart, show that this was an outsider, someone who moved to Västerås sometime after the tooth was formed, basically, sometimes after childhood. One possible explanation then is that this male was someone who joined the monastic order, became a Dominican friar and moved to Västerås, and then as part of becoming an adult, becoming a clerical male, he also adopted a somewhat different diet. Another example is down here where you have a green dot, and this is someone buried in the cemetery. In this case, it is a young adult who was decapitated at the age of around 20 years old. Sulfur values from this person shows that he was also non-local, so someone who moved to Västerås. And radiocarbon dates shows that this could possibly, but not necessarily, be connected to the 1521 Battle of Västerås. That was a battle between the Kalmar Union and the Swedish rebels who wanted to break out of the Union. Possibly then, I'm speculating a bit here, but this could have been one of the Danish soldiers who was decapitated in connection to this battle. And then that would mean that his sort of role as an adult male would be a warrior, a part of the Danish troops stationed at Västerås Castle. And typical diet, if you look at the food inventories of castles and the osteological remains of bone from animals, that they would eat quite a lot of meat, and also they would eat different type of meat compared to people in towns or in monasteries. They're more bone from game, from different wild animals. So meat eating could be part of the identity for this group of males. So you could see it changes sort of from the bottom of the chart here up to sort of a little bit higher, but still pretty low. So even if you had a fish now and then, it was not a major part of the diet in the same way as those who are higher up here. So this would be an example of how a changed life ways and changed identity could have an effect on your body, or at least the isotope composition of your body. You might not notice it yourself, but it could also be the other way around, that changes to the body have an impact on the way you behave and the way you're able to enact masculinity. And I'm looking at this cranium now with a battle wound to sort of illustrate the complex difference or a problem here with warrior masculinity. For on the one hand, you have to participate in battle and have you put yourself at risk to show strength and bravery. But on the other hand, this risk meant that you might be injured and lose your capability to participate in battle. And this is likely what happened to this person. You can see that up here by the wound, there is some bone growth. So this person survived and it started to heal, but it did not heal completely. He did not recover from the injury and finally died then. And the radiocarbon dating to show that this could possibly also be one of the warriors who participated in the 1521 battle. Description of this battle tells about how the mercenaries who were on the losing side really gave up. They threw away their weapons, sort of leaving their warrior identity, and they ran to the priory and cried for absolution and wanted to be let in there. So here you can see, I mean, we don't know from this description if they were injured or not, but I think that could be one reason to like this person would not be fit to continue fighting in the battle, and perhaps have to think of other things to do. Maybe he wasn't even able to run away. Maybe they had to carry him off the battlefield and into the priory. But this shows how your body will limit your abilities to enact different types of masculinities. Now, one possibility then is to leave warrior life altogether and start doing something else. If you survive this, perhaps join a monastic order where injuries could be just, not a problem, but actually something that will help you with your humility and being like a good Christian. But on the other hand, you could also sort of maintain a warrior identity, perhaps as a war veteran instead, and relive past glories through storytelling instead of actual active participants in battle. But there was also the possibility, of course, that you actually survived and recovered. Here you see an individual who got a massive blow to the head here, but this fracture has healed. So it's just like a shallow depression. And then if we look at the other side of the cranium, there is an unhealed blade wound. So this person apparently returned to battle after a blow to the head, and was not discouraged by the sort of obvious dangers of medieval warfare. If we look at clerical masculinities, there could be a parallel here that your body is important for your ability to perform clerical masculinity. And then I've looked at oral health. And there are two reasons for like picking the mouth as the focus area. One is that speech was very important part of being a cleric and what you did when you were praying and singing in the church and so on. So the ability to speak was sort of central to the clerical masculinity. And another thing is that this was a highly visible part of the body. So if you have lost all your teeth, it would be hard to hide. It would be obvious to everybody around you. So, and this goes back to sort of a double role of the clerical body. It should be perfect without blemishes. Ideally, if you're going to be ordained as priest, you're not allowed to have any bodily defects. And there could be exceptions. You could ask the Pope for dispensation if there was some kind of problem, if it was not too serious. If it was disabling, so you're not able to perform your duty, that was not okay. Or if you look so scary, so it will cause a scandal, then it could not be accepted either. Basically, losing your teeth could pose a problem, but then it probably was not so serious. You probably could still speak, even if when losing a few teeth, even if it sounded a bit differently. And particularly as you see in this example, losing the front teeth, then certain sounds such as sh would be harder to produce, but you would not be like completely mute or anything. And also, I mean, people around you would see that the teeth are missing, but likely not associate this with some kind of scandalous behavior. I mean, losing the teeth could be associated with sort of aggressive behavior and getting your teeth knocked out, and it was even used as a form of punishment. Or you could mutilate your enemies by knocking their teeth out, and it's sort of a form of disgrace to be mutilated like that. But most of the tooth loss is not due to trauma. And in this case, it is part of general poor oral health. And you can see, for example, that the roots of the teeth are exposed. So this individual is suffering from severe periodontitis. He also had caries, which is very unusual in medieval Iceland, but there are like rare cases. So this person suffered from bad oral health in many respects, and losing the teeth was only part of it. So he didn't likely look like someone who's been breaking the religious rules and been in a fight, but someone who's, you know, generally aged and at somewhat poor health. So that would not cause a scandal at all. I mean, lots and lots of people had lost their teeth. It was really common. In the Skriðuklaustur, those who were, say, about over the age of 35, so sort of middle-aged to old people, about 10% or so had lost at least a quarter of their dentition, so at least 8 teeth. So it was not unexpected to see at that time. So to summarize, and in this image you see examples from Västerås of men with blunt force trauma to the, or some cases healed sharp force trauma to the head. And you can see that there is a pattern. They are occurring at the forehead in many, many cases, slightly different position, but more or less this seemed to be a typical behavior that a lot of people are engaging in, that they're basically hitting each other over the head over and over again. And this was probably an accepted way to enact masculinity, that the right type of violence, the type of violence that you could be socially accepted. So to summarize, the study of medieval masculinities is an established field of research, and scholars from different disciplines are contributing using different source materials and different methods. Using human remains as a source is particularly suitable if you want to look at the embodiment of masculinities and the relation of between sort of masculinity and body, and how gendered practices have an impact on your body. Through these case studies, both similarities and differences could be seen between different groups of men, and also how masculinity could change through the life course. But sort of individual cases are always open to different interpretations, and I think like future studies on larger materials would really be interesting to show even greater diversity of perhaps other groups of males who are not included in this study. So I hope I didn't take too long now when we have this break in the middle, but thank you very much for listening. And here again, you have my email address, and you have logos from organizations who supported my research, and I'll end it here.